How's it going, everybody? Hope you're having a wonderful day. So now that Strixhaven has been out for a little while, I want to take a closer look at some of those cards and evaluate their potential in Cube. A quick note before we get into the honorable mentions, I'm not including any Mystical Archive cards in this list because there's just so many of them, and really there aren't many cards from the archives that just flat out aren't amazing in Cube. However, I may potentially make a separate top 10 list for those if that's something you guys are interested in. So let's start out with a few honorable mentions. Teach by Example is an instant for 2 red-blue hybrid mana that lets you copy the next instant or sorcery you cast, and you can choose new targets for that copy. I think this card is specifically really great in Pauper cubes with any kind of like spells matter archetype. And Accomplished Alchemist can potentially ramp out some huge creatures in your cube if you have like a heavy life gain archetype built in. And Archmage Emeritus, I'm not sure how to pronounce that one, has the Magecraft ability to draw a card every time you cast an instant or sorcery, making it a pretty good candidate for a spell heavy deck as well, particularly like a modern or pioneer power level cube. And Lorehold Command is a very versatile card that Boros has kind of desperately been needing, I feel, effectively being a Lightning Helix, a creature buff with protection from wraths, card draw at the cost of a permanent, or even just making a 3/2 body. I'm a really big fan of the design on this card, and really just a lot of Lorehold cards in general. Moving into the list at number 10, we have Secret Rendezvous. Secret Rendezvous is a 3-mana white sorcery that lets you draw 3 cards, which is an ability white has been desperately needing. Pretty big downside being your opponent also draws 3 cards without actually paying any mana. I think it's exciting that white is finally getting a way to fill the hand, but at the same time, this is still not really card advantage, as you're spending 1 card to give yourself as well as your opponent 3 cards. However, I do feel like this does have a place in some cubes. Coming in at number 9 is Belladros Witherbloom. For Golgari colors and 5 generic mana, you get a 4/4 Elder Dragon with flying that creates a pest token at the beginning of every upkeep that you gain a life when they die. The more interesting part of this card is an ability that lets you pay 10 life once per turn to untap all of your lands, making cards like Heartbeat of Spring or Mana Flare absolutely incredible. The only thing stopping this from being higher on my list is it's already a 7 mana spell, meaning it'll be harder to take advantage of the lands untapping early enough in the game. Although I do still think there's a place for this card in a lot of cubes as well. So at number 8, I've placed Strixhaven Stadium, a 3-mana artifact that taps to add 1 colorless mana, as well as put a point counter on itself. Whenever a creature deals damage to you, remove a counter. When one of your creatures deals damage to an opponent, put a counter on it. Then if the stadium has 10 or more counters on it, remove all counters and your opponent loses the game. I really like the flavor of this card, acting as keeping score in a sporting event. And while it's definitely a slower way to win the game a lot of times, alternate win conditions are really fun to try to make work. I really like this in a cube with cards like Doubling Season and Voral maybe, or even Winding Constrictor. At number 7, I have Strict Proctor. Strict Proctor is a 1/3 flyer for 1 white and 1 generic mana, with text that reads whenever a permanent entering the battlefield causes an ability to trigger, counter that ability unless its controller pays 2. I think this card is great in a typical mono white deck, dealing incremental damage and having evasion, and making our opponent have to pay a bit more for cards like Snapcaster and Eternal Witness. The only downside being obviously this is a symmetrical ability, and in mono white you also want to run a lot of creatures that do things when they enter the battlefield, like Blade Splicer or Skyclave Apparition. So this does kind of neuter those cards, however I do think it's still worth including a lot of the time. Moving on to number 6, we're looking at Professor Onyx. For 2 black and 4 generic mana, we get a 5 Loyalty Walker with a plus ability that helps dig through our deck and also fill the graveyard, a -3 that takes care of our opponent's biggest creature on board, and a -8 reminiscent of Torment of Hailfire. Overall, what we'd expect from a 6 mana Liliana. However, what I'm really interested in is the Magecraft ability. With this in play every time you cast or copy an instant or sorcery, you essentially staple a Tendrils of Agony to it, functioning as a more incremental win condition for a lot of Storm or just spell-heavy decks in general. In any cube with fast mana, I think this should at least be considered. The number 5 spot on this list is held by Velomachus Lorehold, another 7 mana Elder Dragon from this set. this time being a 5/5 with flying, vigilance, and haste. When Lorehold attacks, look at the top 7 cards of your library. You may cast an instant or sorcery with mana value less than Velomachus Lorehold's power without paying its mana cost, and put the rest in the bottom of your library. I think Boros has historically had a bit of an identity crisis mechanically, and it really feels like Wizards has kind of pushed back to try to fix that with this set. In my cube at least, red-white is probably the least drafted color pairing, aside from like mono red splashing a few white cards and vice versa. And having big flashy cards like this to incentivize drafting Boros is kind of great. At number 4 we have Prismari Command, a 3-mana red and blue instant. Like most cards with command in the name, this is a modal card allowing you to choose any 2 from the list of dealing 2 damage to any target, target player draws 2 cards, then discards 2 cards, target player creates a treasure token, or destroy target artifact. So this is a super versatile card for blue and red, and I'm personally considering replacing Electrolyze in my cube with this. So sneaking in at number 3, I have Rip Apart. Rip Apart is a 2-mana Boros sorcery that can either deal 3 damage to a creature or planeswalker, or destroy an artifact or enchantment. This is another pretty versatile modal spell that I think is a more than suitable replacement for Wear Tear in most cubes. And holding down the number 2 spot on this list, I have a double face card with Wandering Archaic and Explore the Vastlands. Both sides being colorless and having the ability to slot in any deck I think really helps. The sorcery side of this card being a symmetrical way to look at the top 5 cards of your library and put a land, instant, or sorcery into your hand and gain 3 life. So your opponent also gets that. The Wandering Archaic side is what's really exciting to me, however, being a 4/4 for 5 mana with text that says whenever an opponent casts an instant or sorcery, they can pay 2 generic mana. If they don't, you can copy and choose new targets for that spell. I really, really like this card, especially in like mono white as a top-end taxing effect. But again, with it being colorless, I think this really has a lot of place in a lot of archetypes across different cubes. And at number 1 on this list is Elite Spellbinder. For 1 mana and 2 generic, we get a 3/1 flying human cleric with the ability to look at our opponent's hand when it enters the battlefield and exile a card from it. For as long as it remains exiled, our opponent can cast it, but it costs 2 generic more to cast. So like I mentioned earlier with Boros struggling to have its own mechanical identity, I feel like a lot of people would agree that white in general has had the same problem for a while now, and these kinds of cards just feel very white and are also super powerful. This provides you with flawless information about your opponent's hand and also sets them back 2 turns on casting their best or most relevant spell, while also being able to beat in for 3 damage in the air every turn. I think this is a great creature and I can't wait to try this one out. So that was my top 10 picks for cards in Strixhaven. Do you agree with my list? Am I missing cards you're including in your cube? Let me know in the comments and subscribe if you haven't already. I've started doing some preliminary work for what's likely going to be a very, very long video that's going to be a little different than the normal stuff on this channel. So that should hopefully be finished and up within the month or so. Thanks for watching, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one.